My son signed the papers on a Tuesday. I remember because it was raining. One of those cold November rains that comes sideways off Lake Michigan and gets into your collar no matter how you hold your coat. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of the attorney's office, and I just sat there for a long time after everyone else had gone inside, watching the windshield fog up. Thinking about Margaret. She would have hated that day. Not the rain. Margaret loved rain. She used to open every window in the house when it rained, even in October, just to smell it. She'd stand there with her coffee and close her eyes and breathe. No, she would have hated what her death had made her son become. Marcus signed those papers and became the sole owner of Hargrove Technical Solutions, the company his mother and I built from a spare bedroom in our house in Naperville over 32 years. We started it with $11,000, a used server rack, and a client list that was really just 4 names on a yellow legal pad. Margaret was the one who made the calls. She was always better with people than I was. I was the engineer. I understood the systems. She understood what people needed those systems to do. We grew it together. Through the 90s tech boom, through the crash, through 9/11, through 2008 when we almost lost everything and Margaret sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning for 6 weeks straight calling every client we had personally to hold the business together. We held it together. When she was diagnosed, we had 47 employees and contracts with 3 Fortune 500 companies. The business was worth conservatively around $30 million. Margaret spent the last 8 months of her life making sure everything was in order. She updated the operating agreement. She met with our attorney, Dale, a man I've known for 25 years, more times than I can count. She told me she was leaving the business to Marcus because she believed in him. She said she saw something in him that reminded her of herself. I didn't argue. She was dying. You don't argue with someone who was dying. What I didn't know, what Marcus didn't know either, was that Margaret had also had a very private conversation with Dale about 3 weeks before she passed. I wasn't in that meeting. I found out about it much later, and everything that happened between then and now traces back to that one meeting I wasn't invited to. Marcus called me 2 weeks after the funeral. He was polite about it, which almost made it worse. He said, "Dad, I've been thinking about the transition, and I really feel like it would be better for the company if we made a clean break. I want to modernize. I want to bring in fresh leadership. I think having you around the office is going to make that harder." I asked him what he meant. He said, I think you should retire. Fully. I've already talked to HR. I was 67 years old and I had been going into that office 5 days a week for 32 years. My name was on the original incorporation documents. My engineering certifications were the reason we qualified for 3 of our largest federal contracts. And my son was telling me, on a phone call, but he'd already talked to HR. I told him I needed a few days to think. He said, "Of course, take your time." And then, after a pause, he said, "Also, the house." I said, "What about the house?" He said the house was technically an asset of the estate. He said his attorney had reviewed everything and the house had been in the business trust for tax purposes since 2019. He said it was part of what he'd inherited. Margaret and I had lived in that house for 21 years. I want to be careful here, because I'm 68 years old and I've had a long time to process what happened. And I don't want to just be an old man ranting into the void. So let me say this carefully. My son is not evil. I don't believe that, but grief does something to people, and money does something to people. And when you combine grief and money and a son-in-law who had been whispering in Marcus's ear for 2 years about untapped equity and legacy dead weight, well, people become versions of themselves that they can't always come back from. His wife, Claudia, was the one who showed up at the house on a Saturday morning with a moving company. I was in the garage when they pulled up. I heard the truck first and thought one of the neighbors was moving. Then I heard Claudia's voice in the driveway giving instructions, and I walked out and saw 3 men in gray uniforms starting to unload dollies. Claudia smiled at me. Very bright, very practiced. She said, "Robert, we wanted to make this as easy as possible for you. The movers are going to help you pack up your personal items. We've arranged for you to stay at the extended stay on Route 59 while you figure out your next steps." I stood there in my garage, in my house, and I looked at this woman my son had married, and I didn't say anything for a long moment. Behind her, through the open front door, I could see one of the movers already pulling a box from Margaret's bookshelf in the hallway. Margaret's books, still in the order she'd left them. I said, "Claudia, I'd like to speak to Marcus." She said Marcus was at the office. Very busy. The transition, I called him. He didn't pick up. I called Dale instead. Dale answered on the second ring, which told me he'd been expecting my call. He said, "Robert, come in Monday. There are some things we need to discuss. Don't sign anything between now and then. Don't let them move anything you don't want moved." I said, "Dale, what's going on?" He said, "Monday, Robert. Trust me." I left the house that day with 2 suitcases, a box of Margaret's photographs, and my laptop. I drove to my brother's place in Wheaton, because I wasn't going to give Claudia the satisfaction of seeing me check into that extended stay. My brother Frank let me sleep in his guest room without asking too many questions. He made me eggs in the morning and didn't say much, which was exactly right. Those 3 days were the longest of my life. I lay in Frank's guest room and stared at the ceiling and thought about 32 years. I thought about the early days when Marcus was small, when he used to come to the office on school holidays and sit on the floor next to my desk drawing pictures while I worked. I thought about teaching him to ride his bike in the church parking lot on Plainfield Road. I thought about the summer he turned 16 and worked for us doing data entry and complained every single day, and how Margaret and I laughed about it every night after he'd gone to bed. I thought about all of it, and I tried to figure out where it had gone. Monday morning, I was at Dale's office at 8 sharp. His paralegal, a young woman named Sophia, who I've known since she was a law school intern, brought me coffee and then closed the door quietly behind her. Dale sat across from me with a folder on his desk, and his expression was the kind of careful neutral that lawyers practice their whole careers. He said, "Margaret came to see me on October 3rd, about 3 weeks before she died." I remembered that day. I thought she'd had a follow-up appointment with her oncologist. Dale said she had concerns about Marcus and Claudia. She had seen some things over the previous year that worried her. He paused. She loved her son. You know that. But she also knew him. And she knew Claudia. And she wanted to make sure that if her instincts were right, there was a backstop. He opened the folder. The operating agreement Marcus had signed gave him control of Hargrove Technical Solutions. The name, the goodwill, the client relationships, and the day-to-day operations. That was all accurate. But Marcus's attorney had apparently not caught, buried in a rider attached to the original Articles of Incorporation from 1991, was that the core technology infrastructure, the proprietary diagnostic software we developed between 1998 and 2011, the stuff that every federal contract we'd ever held ran on, was not part of the business entity. It was held under a separate IP trust. And the sole trustee of that IP trust was me. I looked at Dale. He said, "Margaret set this up 6 weeks before she died. It's airtight. I've had 2 outside attorneys review it. The software is yours, Robert, not Marcus's. The business can't legally operate without licensing it from you. Every federal contract they hold references it in the compliance documentation." I said, "She never told me." He said, "She didn't want you to have to carry it. She said." He glanced down at his notes. He was reading from something she'd actually written. She said, "Robert will fight too hard to keep the peace. He'll give Marcus everything and tell himself it's fine. I need someone to fight for him after I'm gone." I had to take a minute there. Dale let me. When I came back, I asked him what it meant practically. He said it meant that every contract Marcus currently held, every federal account, every client relationship that ran on our diagnostic platform, which was all of them, because we had literally never updated the underlying infrastructure to anything else, was operating on licensed software whose license had quietly lapsed the day Margaret died, because the license had been held personally by her, and transferring it to me was something Marcus would have to formally acknowledge, request, and negotiate. He didn't know that yet. What happened over the next 3 weeks was something I'm still not entirely comfortable describing, because I'm not a vindictive man, and I don't want to sound like one. But I also believe in accountability. Margaret believed in it. She used to say that the worst thing you could do for someone was let them avoid the consequences of who they were. The first call came from Marcus on a Wednesday. His tone was different, still controlled, but underneath it something was fraying. He said the Department of Defense Contracting Office had flagged a compliance issue with their current certification, something about IP documentation. He said it was probably just paperwork and he was sure I'd want to help clear it up given that my name was on the original filing. I said I'd be happy to discuss it, and I told him Dale would be handling all communications on my behalf. There was a silence. He said, "Dad, you got a lawyer?" I said, "I've had the same lawyer for 25 years, Marcus. You know Dale." Another silence. He said, "I'm sure we can work this out between us." I said, "I'm sure we can. Have your attorney call Dale." The second call came from Claudia, which surprised me. She called my cell directly. I let it go to voicemail. She left a long message that started very professional and ended with her voice slightly higher than it should have been. Something about the family business and what Margaret would have wanted. I sent the voicemail to Dale. It was during the third week at Frank's kitchen table over coffee that Marcus showed up in person. He rang the doorbell on a Sunday morning. I saw him through the window before I answered. He was alone. No Claudia. He was wearing a jacket I didn't recognize. Expensive, the kind Claudia would have picked out. And he looked like he hadn't been sleeping. I opened the door and we looked at each other for a moment. He said, "Can I come in?" We sat at Frank's kitchen table. Frank made himself scarce. I poured Marcus a cup of coffee and sat down across from him and waited. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I didn't know about the IP trust." I said, "I know." He said, "We have a compliance review in 11 days. If we can't document the licensing chain, we lose the DoD contract. That's the Morrison account, $12 million annually." I said, "I know." He said, "Dad," and then he stopped. I looked at my son who I taught to ride a bike in a church parking lot, my son who used to draw pictures on the floor next to my desk, my son who had told me on a phone call that my services were no longer needed at the company his mother and I had built, and whose wife had shown up at my house on a Saturday morning with a moving truck. He said, "I made a mistake." He said it quietly, not like a man who had prepared a speech, like a man who had finally gotten to the end of a road and found it was a wall. I didn't say anything right away. I looked at him and I thought about Margaret standing at the window in the rain, with her coffee and her eyes closed. I thought about her sitting with Dale on October 3rd, fighting for me after she was gone, the way she'd been fighting for everything she loved her whole life. I said, "Marcus, the license can be transferred. I'm willing to do that. But we're going to do this properly. There are going to be conditions. The house gets transferred back into my name. My personal belongings get returned. We draw up a formal licensing agreement with Dale, not just a handshake. And whatever Claudia's involvement has been in the business decisions of the last month, that gets examined too." He nodded. He kept nodding slowly like each one cost him something. I said, "I'm not doing this to punish you. I want you to understand that. I loved your mother, and I love you, and I'm not interested in burning down what she built. But I'm also not going to let you treat me like I'm nothing. I'm your father, and before I was your father, I was a man who spent 32 years earning the right to sit at that table." He said, "I know, Dad." He didn't say much else. We finished the coffee. Frank came back through and shook Marcus's hand and pretended not to notice that Marcus's eyes were red. The legal process took about 6 weeks. Dale was thorough. The house came back to me by early January. Marcus and Claudia had apparently had significant conversations of their own during that period. I don't know exactly what was said between them, and I'm not sure I want to. What I know is that Claudia was less present at the office by February, and by spring she had taken a position at a marketing firm downtown. Whatever their marriage looked like after all of that, it wasn't my business. Marcus and I had dinner together for the first time in April, just the two of us, at a steakhouse in Naperville we used to go to when he was in high school. He ordered the same thing he always ordered. Sirloin, medium, baked potato, no sour cream. We talked about the business, we talked about his childhood, some. We talked about the childhood, some. We talked about Margaret. He cried once, briefly, and I let him. At the end of the night he said, "I don't know how she knew." I said, "She always knew. That was your mother." He said, I'm sorry, Dad, for all of it. I believed him. That's the thing about knowing someone their whole life. You can usually tell when they mean it. I'm back in the house now. I repainted the hallway in the spring. Same color Margaret picked in 2009, a warm gray she called November morning. I put her books back on the shelf in the order she left them. I open the windows when it rains. I'm not the same man I was before she died. I don't think you can go through what we went through, what I went through, and come out the other side unchanged. But I'm still here. I'm still the man who built something from $11,000 in a yellow legal pad. I'm still the man she married. I'm still his father. And I've learned something in all of this that I think about almost every day. Margaret knew it long before I did. She'd probably known it for years and just never wanted to say it out loud. The things you build, the real things, the things that last, aren't in the contracts or the accounts or the corporate filings. They're in the people. They're in what you taught them and what you showed them and what you were willing to do for them even when they gave you every reason not to. She spent her last weeks on this earth making sure I'd be okay. I think about that a lot. I think about that every single morning when I open the windows and smell the rain. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened, more than I wanted, honestly. There were nights at Frank's house where I'd lie there in the dark and run the whole thing back like a film reel. Every phone call, every silence, every moment I told myself it would work itself out if I just gave it time. And I'd ask myself, how did we get here? How does a man end up a stranger in the house he built, in the company he bled for, in the life he gave everything to? I don't think there's one answer. I think it happens the way most slow disasters happen. Quietly, in small steps that each feel almost reasonable, until you're standing in your own garage watching a stranger carry your wife's books out the door. What I know now is this: the way you raise someone shapes the person they become under pressure, not the person they are when things are easy. Anyone can be decent when life is going well. The real character, the thing that's actually in there, shows up when there's money on the table and grief in the room and someone whispering that they deserve more. That's when you find out what you actually built. I don't blame Marcus entirely. I've thought about that a lot too. Claudia had his ear for years before Margaret died, and I won't pretend I paid close enough attention to what that was doing to him. I told myself it wasn't my business, that he was a grown man, that Margaret was right there and she'd say something if it got bad, but Margaret was fighting her own battle, and I was watching her fight it. And the quieter things, the shifting of values, the slow erosion of gratitude, those I missed. That's on me. What Margaret didn't miss, that woman saw her son more clearly than either of us wanted to admit, and she still loved him completely, and she still fought for him by fighting for me. She sat in Dale's office and made a plan, not out of anger, but out of a kind of clear-eyed love that I'm still trying to fully understand. She didn't build a trap for Marcus. She built a floor for me. There's a difference. The consequences Marcus faced weren't punishment handed down from somewhere. They were just the natural result of choices he made, catching up with him at the speed reality travels. That's the thing about accountability. It's not dramatic. It doesn't arrive with thunder. It just shows up one Tuesday morning when a compliance officer flags a contract and suddenly the ground isn't where you thought it was. Marcus came back because he had to, but he also came back, I think, because some part of him had always known. You don't cry like that, quietly at a kitchen table over a cup of coffee you didn't finish, unless something real is breaking open in you. I've seen men perform remorse. That wasn't performance. That was my son finally stopping long enough to feel the weight of what he'd done. I chose to work it out with him. Not because I'm a pushover, not because I was afraid of the alternative. I chose it because Margaret built that company so that something would last, so that the people she loved would still be connected to each other after she was gone. Walking away from Marcus permanently would have meant letting grief and money win. I wasn't willing to do that. What I want anyone listening to take from this is simple. Not easy. Simple. The relationships that matter have to be tended. Not just when it's convenient, not just when the other person is behaving well. The tending is the whole thing, and the values you carry. The honesty, the steadiness, the willingness to show up even when it costs you. Those aren't just personal virtues. They're the only real protection you have. No contract, no filing, no IP trust can substitute for being a person of character. Margaret knew that. She built the trust because she was realistic. But she also spent 32 years being exactly who she was, and that is what ultimately brought her son back to the table. I still open the windows when it rains. Some mornings it feels like she's still right there,